Okay, so hopefully this now is working with audio. Please let me know if that is the case or not. I will, in the meantime, start this live stream. Hopefully we do actually have the audio. I just did one and there was no audio, so if you could let me know by writing in the chat whether we have or not. So welcome to another State of the Russo-Ukrainian War with Connor Klein. I'm actually not in my apartment since the one was not even out in the open, so now I gotta turn that on so that you get notified that I'm actually here again. A lot of technical problems this evening, and it is a very important week. Yes, I see that I have audio. I can check it on my own laptop here. So welcome. I'm here in Odessa. I'm actually in the cafe, as you see, because, well, electricity is out in my apartment. This is one of the things that you have to live with here in Ukraine during the Russo-Ukrainian war. It hasn't been so bad over the last, say, 2 weeks. Previous 2 weeks, it's out just for a few hours a day, but unfortunately, when I'm about to do this live stream, it was out. And the first one is tomorrow, when Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, he will go to London to meet with European leaders. It is a critical period. He has been involved in those negotiations with the Americans, who are acting as some sort of mediators, so to state, although they are not seen in a very positive light as objective or pro-Ukrainian at all. We had, which was my last video, Trump's national security strategy, where it outlined an extremely pro-Russian point. White House is just one of the organs in the U.S. political system. Donald Trump is not a dictator. There are a lot of powers given to the Congress. In general, Ukraine is very popular in the U.S. vis-a-vis Russia. The majority of Americans support supplying arms to Ukraine and support Ukraine to defeat even Russia. And even within the Republican Party, the majority now is pro-sending weapons to Ukraine or supporting Ukraine, depending how the question is asked. And even there is a minority of the MAGA wing of the Republican Party. It's about 20% that support Ukraine. So it's really a small minority that's around the current president that is leading this policy. I've seen another commentator refer to the national security strategy, which is a huge departure from American foreign policy of the last 80 years, and the first Trump administration's national security strategy has been described as geopolitical suicide by the U.S. It is extremely anti the European Union, basically strategy to undermine a quick resolution to the Russo-Ukrainian war, which would be in effect from what we've seen from Donald Trump on Russia's terms. For his leader Volodymyr Zelensky, and tomorrow he goes to meet with other European leaders. There is a parallel with back at the beginning of the 2022 invasion, when there were negotiations between Minsk and in Istanbul, where another capitulation agreement was put on the table by Russia, which at the time Ukraine clearly refused to sign. And there is the famous instance when the then UK Prime Minister Boris in person and that his European and North American allies would sign with material by Vladimir Putin at that. I would expect to see something similar happen tomorrow. There's already been leaked calls between the Germans, the French president, Emmanuel Macron, security guarantees they might offer because it would not be reliable. It is written out in the national security strategy, basically, that U.S. under Trump is not going to come to the aid of a NATO member that is attacked by Russia. It completely undermines Article 5, what is written there. You can go back to yesterday's video to get more detail about that. But basically, it says that European security is the responsibility of Europeans. And the US is not interested, Russia is not an adversary according to them. Actually, the European Union and it seems most European Union's member states are considered, didn't use the word adversary, but definitely considered not to be partners of the current administration. The current administration also said that they are going to be working to undermine those governments and the European Union with the purpose of installing more populist, nationalist politicians who in general tend to be pro-Kremlin. So it is quite remarkable as a document, and it looks like kind of a bit of a trap for Zelensky, because maybe Trump offers him an Article 5-like security guarantee, doing the air quotes. What I saw in that 28-point plan in the text was the word assurances when you read into the text of it, and that is the same language as is contained in the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, where Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in return for security assurances from Russia, US, UK. And clearly, once Russia invaded Crimea in 2016 and parts of the Donbass, those assurances meant absolutely nothing. So at the moment, under the current Trump administration, at this point in time, even Article 5 is very questionable if it actually means anything with respect to the US. Of course, the other European allies of an attacked NATO member, if that were Latvia or Estonia or Poland, one would expect most of those, or many of them at least, to come to that country's aid with presumably sending troops to the ground. Article 5 doesn't actually lay out what to do very clearly. It's always been believed as a deterrence mechanism that would mean the US sending troops in order to eject any troops, like back in the day it was the Soviet troops, and now it's the Russian troops who would invade another country. So it's going to be very interesting to see what comes out of that. I've said continuously on this channel that these negotiations will go nowhere. Neither side is going to sign an agreement, because at the moment it's unclear who will win militarily, and politics is war is the continuation of politics. By the famous adage by Karl von Clausewitz, who was a famous Russian military strategist, that he wrote a book on war, From Kriege. That is one of the famous adages that he pronounced. And the war will go on. Vladimir Putin is not going to sign a peace deal, even the one that he basically, well, the Russians wrote, 28 points, because if Trump is able to persuade Zelensky to sign that, why doesn't Putin just demand more? Move the overtime window for what's politically accepted so much more in his favor that he can probably get a few more concessions if he fights on for another 6 months. At the same time, Zelensky would probably not have the support of the parliament. He's not a dictator. He can't just, unlike Vladimir Putin, so he would need to support the parliament and the support of the population of Ukraine. And he doesn't have any of those three to sign such an agreement as has been discussed. No one is going to trust, or very few people who are sincerely going to trust Donald Trump and his administration for any sort of security guarantee. Securities come back as the Trump 47 administration, and in particular after the publication of National Security Strategy, which basically outlines that the U.S. does not intend to uphold Article 5. It also said it won't, it will basically block any further enlargement of NATO. That doesn't just apply to Ukraine, but also could apply to Ireland, my own country, if they suddenly wanted to join. For example, Austria, another country that's not in NATO, Switzerland, could be Moldova, which would be very concerned if Ukraine started to collapse and the Russian troops were advancing near its border. So definitely something to watch out for. The other two things are, of course, what is going on, why I have electricity, a lot of strikes by drones and rockets on infrastructure here. We saw the train station hit in just near to Kiev and Fastiv, and also the Russians struck a medical supplies manufacturer, so presumably we'll probably have some shortages of some medicines here, considering that that is part of Russia's strategy to punish the civilian population, try to undermine the spirit of Ukrainians. I think it's been largely counterproductive for the entire period of this extended invasion since 2022, and I don't expect that to change. However, it does cause a lot of disruption here with respect to having electricity at home all the time. It's not that big a deal so far, but as you saw for today's live stream, so expect to see a lot of those continued attacks on from both sides. also attacking Russia's oil export infrastructure system that earned it the money to continue its war machine against Ukraine and probably pretty soon against other parts of Europe, judging by what they've been doing in this gray area of drone attacks and we'll call them drone attacks, drone incursions, air incursions, sabotage on railways, poisonings, and it's the like. And the third thing to watch out for is what is happening on the front. We've been talking about Pokrovsk, the city in the Donbass, for over a year, and the Russians are very close to taking the city. It's a basic conurbation of Pokrovsk with Minohrad. It's another town right beside it, and there still are Ukrainian troops holding Minohrad. The way the war has been fought seems to change at the most every 2 years. I actually watched the documentary 20 Days in Mariupol last night, and the way the war was fought at the beginning compared to, say, 2 years ago in 2023, when there's another quite good documentary to watch called 2,000 Meters to Andriivka. There it had changed dramatically in terms of the way the war has been fought. And again, fast forward to today, the war is fought in a different way yet again. So back in 2022, the Russian Air Force was basically bombing everything freely in the center of Mariupol. They were flying over. I was watching. The soldiers could do nothing about it. They didn't have good enough air defense to shoot down those Russian planes. So they had, I guess people say they never had air dominance, but they definitely had a lot of air control. They were able to run those kind of sorties. There was a lot of artillery. The tanks were driving into city centers, and there weren't really any trenches. Then we see in 2023 it was mainly trench warfare, and they have these fortifications built, and basically would have to send in troops to clear them. It was very costly in terms of manpower in that 2023 Ukrainian offensive to try and take back parts of the Donbass and southern Ukraine. They have been successful in late 2022 around liberating the city of Kherson, parts of the Mykolaiv Oblast that were under occupation, and in the Kharkiv Oblast. However, that did not continue. They only made small gains, and it became this analogy with World War I. However, now because of the evolution of drones and drone warfare, back in 2020, if we go back to 2022 at the very beginning, there was very little drone warfare in the Bayraktars being used in observational drones. And then in 2023, there were some kamikaze drones being used, but now this kind of no man's land is quite wide because there's so much cover from the drones from both sides. It is very hard to operate within, say, about 20 kilometer radius, 10 kilometers on each side, and maybe it's even larger. So that becomes a gray area when you have troops on either side, and no one really controls it. They can send the soldiers into different areas and maybe temporarily raise a flag and claim they control it. However, it could be within half an hour those soldiers, 4 or 5 soldiers are dead, and the flags have been replaced by the opposite side. So there is a lot of a greater fog of war about knowing what's going on. However, there is up to 1,000 Ukrainian troops in the Minohrad pocket. It is effectively encircled. However, because of this gray area and hard to put troops there to really block them off or equipment, it's basically been covered by drones, which means evacuating now is very difficult. However, at night, under the cover of fog, it makes drones very hard to operate, and Ukraine, it is very damp and foggy over the last few weeks, so it would still be possible, with probably for Ukraine significant losses, to withdraw those troops. I would expect them to evacuate Minohrad and Pokrovsk in the next week or two. We may even see it this week, because there's probably not so much to be gained in terms of a favorable kill ratio, in terms of Russian losses versus Ukrainian losses by holding on to those conditions. They probably can't supply it with vehicles anymore, or it's very, very rare to be able to do so. They're probably sending drones in with supplies. Interesting to see how siege warfare can be changed by that. The fact that Ukrainians can send in supplies using the drones, so their soldiers can still get ammunition and food sustenance and stay there. However, they probably will not stay much longer. So those are the 3 things to watch out for this week. Drop me your comments down below what you think of how the negotiations or the meeting tomorrow will go, and the negotiations in general that are being led under the auspices of Jared Kushner and Stevie Witkoff, two people who have close to zero diplomatic experience or knowledge of the region, who are basically businessmen and representatives of Trump Incorporated. So, and let me know what you think about the state of Ukraine and Russia on the front, and these attacks that are deeper used by Russia and Ukraine. Russia tends to target a mixture of Ukrainian logistical, military logistics and civilian targets behind the lines, whilst Ukraine focuses on Russian exports and damaging those, since they are elements that keep the war machine going. Just as a final point, India, Vladimir Putin went to India the past week and seems to have secured a lot of favorable business deals with the Indians, including receiving $2 billion US dollars in exchange for a nuclear-powered submarine that will keep their war machine going for a bit longer. Also, the Indians have agreed to start building drones that presumably then will be exported back to Russia. So basically, Russia can move a significant part of its drone production to India, which would make it very hard for Ukraine to strike. As Ukraine's strike capabilities get better and better, they can aim and to destroy the factories in Russia to produce the armaments of war. However, if Russia is able to move those to India and North Korea, then that would make it, or China, then that's extremely difficult for the Ukrainians to cut that off. So those are the developments. I will see you tomorrow on this channel for another video. Let me know what you think, and Slava Ukraini, Rom Slava, do better.